Hello, everyone. It's great to have the opportunity here today to talk to you about the millennial generation. I think it's obviously a generation that is impacting the world tremendously, but especially from the perspective of how we see and how we perceive a job. So they really are kind of at the forefront of a cultural revolution, and obviously, in this part of the world, they're creating a lot of changing and leading companies to have to rethink their strategies and really understand them in order to be able to attract them successfully. So today I will share with you information about who they are. Why is it so important that we understand them, not only for the purpose of recruiting them, but also for the purpose of retaining them? How do their preferences and expectations vary across the different markets in Asia? And what are some of the things that companies need to keep in mind in order to make sure that they are relevant to this audience and can successfully position their organization as a place where their target talent can grow and learn and contribute? So I will start, as you can see here today, by giving a brief introduction about Universum, and then we'll talk about how the world has changed. I have personally been working with this generation since 2005 and worked with a lot of different authors and understanding what impact do they have. But obviously, Asia is such a diversified and diverse region that millennials cannot really be bunched all together, but we need to look at it from a market-to-market basis. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how their preferences differ across markets in Asia, and what are some steps towards success, what are ways to engage them, and then also at the end some takeaways or things that hopefully you can think about when you engage millennials or think about engaging millennials. So as mentioned prior by my colleague Shu, I've been working with Universum now for about 10 years, 12 years in the industry, and Universum is the global leader in employer branding. What we're primarily known for is for all the research that we conduct among the millennials. So we survey about 900,000 millennials yearly across the entire world, and what we do is we help companies work with this information to understand, what is it that their target group really wants, but also how are they perceived among their target audience, because only by understanding how students and professionals think about you and the reasons why they're not attracted to you can you obviously address those questions with communication and position your brand more successfully. But obviously, as you can see here, we've been in this industry for 26 years. We work with over 1,200 clients globally, and we help companies not only with the research, but then also with advisory services as well as communication solutions. So once you understand, what your unique selling points are, how do you make sure that you communicate these effectively to millennials, and how do you make sure that you can attract them and retain them within your organization? If we look at the next slide, you can see here that Universum has a global presence. So obviously we survey millennials all across the world. In the orange countries, we survey them on a yearly basis, and then the results are usually published in our ideal employer rankings. In the markets that are in gray, we still conduct tons of millennial research, but we do not have official rankings. In Asia, as you can see, we survey every year Australia, China, Hong Kong, India, Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The last four are the new markets. There's a lot of focus on being able to, position companies successfully in this new Southeast Asia region. So we recently added this as well, and I will be sharing some insight about these markets too. So these are the markets in Asia Pacific that I will be focusing on when it comes to millennials and the impact that they are having here. And this is just a selection of companies that we work with across the region, but we work with pretty much all large organizations and many of the big local players across all these key markets. But enough about that. Let's talk about how millennials have changed the world and how the world has changed. So, one of the key things here to understand is Asia is really a key source of future talent. It's really a market where the war for talent is extremely strong. We asked companies, Fortune 500 companies, as you can see here, what they think is the most challenging market in regards to recruiting talent, but also where is the market where they are expecting the largest recruitment growth. And as you can see, Asia Pacific is not only the one where they're expecting the biggest growth, but also the one that they think and deem and consider the most challenging. Within Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia will experience the largest recruitment growth over the next 3 years. And also we can see that a third of employers actually feel that they do not have a strong enough recruitment presence in these markets. So obviously that is a challenge. But why is it that companies consider and find Asia Pacific to be more challenging than other regions around the world? There's a number of different reasons and a number of different challenges companies are trying to address. One of them, of course, is talent sourcing. So we see that they are having increasing difficulty recruiting talent across these markets. There's very high demand when it comes to both, building a pipeline among students, but also experienced professionals and managers. One of the big challenges also is the quality of candidates. So the majority of educational institutions do not really provide students with those skills that are needed, especially by multinationals, for talent to be successful in a global environment. So we see that the technical skills are very strong, but not necessarily the soft skills. And this is causing, of course, a lot of talent to actually move abroad, to get their education abroad, and a lot of companies to start looking at returnees. So how to identify Asian nationals who are studying in the West and bringing them back. So global recruitment is really becoming a huge opportunity for companies, and we're working with many organizations on helping them identify talent abroad and bringing them back to the market, to their home markets. And then, of course, we know that multinational companies are losing ground to national champions. This is a very strong regional trend. In markets that are more mature from an employer branding standpoint, like Singapore, Hong Kong, for example, Australia, India, China, we see that students actually initially tended to prefer local players. This is if we go back, 7, 8 years. And then all of a sudden, as multinationals started recruiting into the market, there started to be a very strong attraction towards the idea of working for MNCs. But now, however, as the millennials start rising, we see that they are falling back to preferring local firms. And the reason for that is that they are considered more friendly employers, more stable employers, more flexible employers, employers where they can feel more secure and stable. And then, of course, you have the sense of national pride. So we're seeing all over the region that multinational companies are losing to these local giants. And in markets that are less emerged, like Southeast Asia, for example, we know that talent hasn't been exposed to multinationals sufficiently to actually identify them as ideal. So they're still very much relying on local firms. But we expect that to change as more and more multinationals make their way into the market. And then, of course, the perception that money is what talent is really looking for nowadays. So many organizations feel that, well, all that talent really values in this part of the world is money. So if we can't offer as much as the banks or other industries, we don't have a shot. The reality is that with this generation, that is changing very much, and I will talk about that in a little bit. Retention being a persistent problem. We see that 2 years is the average tenure in the region, and in China, the attrition rate is up to 50%, as well as markets like the Philippines, for example. So basically, the recruitment activity has doubled, but only half is growth driven. And then finally, the last challenge that companies face is often the feeling that they don't have the strategic capabilities on the ground to be able to execute employer branding in the right way, because HR teams are often very operational. So how to really kind of bring the markets up to speed on how to engage this talent and how to successfully build and develop talent pipelines. But there's an even greater challenge, and I've talked about it. Obviously, this is the topic of the webinar, but that is the millennials. For those of you who had experience working with the West or work in multinational organizations, you will know that, you will have heard about them. So millennials and Gen Y, it's the same generation. In the US, they're called millennials. In Europe, they're called Gen Y, but it's the same exact generation. And millennials are an interesting group. I was actually running the research department for Universum in 2005 when they started showing up in the States. And what happened that year is that all the undergraduates that we surveyed were millennials, and all the MBAs that we surveyed were Gen Xers, so the previous generation, and that was a 1 year where you had such a distinct cut. And it was so interesting because as I was looking at the data was so different in terms of what they wanted, the companies they considered ideals, the industries they wanted to join, the things that they valued, you know, their perception of what's attractive, that I almost thought that there must be something wrong in the data. So I remember having it looked at over and over and over again. And in reality, that's why the millennials caused so much turmoil, is because they have completely different preferences, completely different backgrounds, and they're very proud of their diverse backgrounds. They have different lives and priorities compared to the previous generation. They have different perceptions of what is attractive. They have a complete different perspective on what's important, and also relationship to money. And they have very, very different profiles and skills. So millennials are a much more diverse group than any generation before them. So of course, you know, this caused companies back then to try to figure out really quickly, how can we make sure to change our message that up to now was meant to attract Gen Xers and baby boomers with very pragmatic aspects of the job, and actually engage a generation that is so much more about the soft side of a company, of an employer. Why is this particularly relevant to all of you today is because generations occur at different times. So basically, generation rise at in different regions at different points in time, and that is heavily due to socioeconomic factors. So if you think about the United States, for example, during World War II, they did not have a war on land. So as soon as the war was over, they could go on to building refrigerators and televisions. The baby boomers rose. You know, the economic recovery rose, and you know, and created that kind of welfare that then led to the millennials coming into the market sooner. In Asia, on the other hand, of course, as well as in Europe, there was a very different reality. You know, if we look at the political situation in China, in India, across the region, so it took a little bit more time for millennials to really settle in. So if you look at it, you can see that in the U.S., millennials are born around 1978 till 2002. While in APAC, the millennials are born between 1986 and 2010. What that means is that they entered university around 2004 in Asia, and they entered the job force in 2008. If you remember, I mentioned that in 2005, I was working in the US for Universum. That's when we saw the biggest impact. That's when the millennials really started to be seen. So if you add about 5 years to 2008, that brings us till about today. So now is really when millennials are starting to show up and have a significant impact in the region. Of course, technology and the internet have facilitated communication between, you know, students in Asia and other parts of the world. So we're already seeing some of these trends, but now is really when you're going to be forced to face them. To understand them, to make sure that not only, you know, your HR teams or from a recruitment perspective you understand them, but also that the managers, the older generations inside the workforce understand them. Otherwise, it's going to be a real problem for a company to continue to hire and recruit the talent they need. So how has employer branding changed? I love this slide. This shows you what employer branding was like in 1913. So this was a job ad. And as you can see, it says men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. And this is really what attracted people. I mean, you know, you're talking about a time where, you know, in the U.S. there were, you know, tons of immigrants coming from all over Europe, all over the world in search of a job, willing to do anything to be able to support the family. And, you know, and at the time we were dealing with the traditionalist generation, but the reality is that's pretty much what up until recently job was about, right? Not this extreme, but a job is about, you know, being able to support your family, being able to have that security and stability that allows you to be able to provide. It's about, you know, ideally making money and reaching leadership positions. Millennials changed all that. So how does that look? So if we look at 11 years ago, so we don't have to go as far back as 1913, but let's go back 11 years in the States. And I'm mentioning the U.S. because this is ground zero. This is where the millennials first came. Then we will focus on the impact they have in Asia, but it's important to understand, you know, the impact that they had and how they were different. So 11 years ago, we asked students in the States, we surveyed about 40,000 students, and they were all Gen Xers. And we asked them, what are your top career goals? What are the things that are most important for you when it comes to your future career? And in 2003, students selected pursue education or certification, become leaders or managers of people, and build a sound financial base. So if you think about it, these are all very pragmatic things, right? I want to continue to improve my skills. I want to eventually get to the point where I can boss someone around, and I want to be able to make money. So nothing too special. Again, very, very pragmatic. And then all of a sudden the millennials came, and we asked that same exact question with the same exact alternatives, and this is what students said instead. Millennials didn't care so much about the certification or management or money. They were more in it for the soft values. They wanted to feel dedicated to a cause. They wanted to feel that they were serving the greater good. They wanted to work for a company with a good reputation. They wanted to work with a company with a friendly working environment. So this is very, very different, right? I mean, I'm a Gen Xer myself, and when I graduated, I wasn't thinking about, I need to find a company where, my boss is wonderful and the environment is friendly and I can do all sorts of good things. It was much more about I need to be able to find a job, ideally in a strong brand, prestigious company where I have the opportunity to build a sound financial base for the future, support my needs, support myself, and become independent. Millennials changed all that. And then, of course, 2008 came, and the economic downturn happened, and so we asked question again. And a lot of companies thought, see, now they're going to change their mind. It's easy to have so many good ideals when you have a job, but what happens when your job gets, made redundant, or your internship gets rescinded? So we asked the same question, and what we found is that it didn't bring them back to basics. The only thing that increased was their need to feel secure and stable, but then they also wanted to work for a company that respected its people. So the concept of respect, of really valuing the people that work for you, seeing them as more than robots or employees, but really like individuals. And then also working for a company with an innovative, creative, and dynamic working environment. And finally, which was very surprising in the States because the US has always been quite ethnocentric, wanting to work for true global employers. Millennials wanted globality. They wanted the international. They wanted the foreign. This is something that we hadn't seen before. So you can see here, just based on this, how what matters to this group has changed and shaped. But what you don't see even in the slides, despite the economic downturn, is going back to, well, the money factor or the prestige of the company. It's about so much more. So if you look about some of the key trends about millennials, and these are consistent across the world, and we see them in Asia as well, so these percentages are based on that. Two things to notice. A, they're the biggest generation ever, and as you can see, by 2025, they will almost represent the majority of your workforce. What that means is that the concept of work, company's DNA is going to change significantly as these students or these professionals reach leadership positions or executive positions. But here's some trends that are interesting. 50% say they would rather have no job than a job they hate. Again, very different from 1913, and in some parts of the region, even recently in some markets, where people had to take jobs just for the purpose of supporting the family and endure all sorts of things in order to be able to provide. 80% say that the work environment is way more important than the size of the paycheck. So all of a sudden, this is a generation that they are kids of divorced parents. They often understand that the reason why their parents divorced had a lot to do with, one of them or both of them not being around enough, not having the time to dedicate to the family, to watch the kids grow. So they realize that at the end of the day, money, yes, is important, but they would rather trade off money in exchange for an environment where that can guarantee that they will have a healthy life and healthy relationships. 87% say the ability to learn is essential to the ideal job. So the professional training and development piece is extremely important. And another thing here to mention for those of you who do not recruit students, for example, but or recruit students in smaller numbers and focus very much on professionals instead. One thing to keep in mind is that whatever strategy you currently have in place to target professional will have to be very short term. When this generation becomes professional, they won't just change because now all of a sudden they're in the workplace. Their values, their preferences, the way in which they will need to be communicated, what they find important will stay the same. So it's interesting because even when we survey millennials who have 10 or plus years of experience in a company, they still value professional training and development as the #1 thing, for example, which is not something that Gen Xers or baby boomers really cared about when they had so much experience under their belt. And then what you can also see is that 80% think they deserve more recognition than they get. And this is also a challenge for many companies. Keep in mind that, you know, if you think about the relationship they have with their parents, it's very different than the relationship that probably your fathers had with their fathers, right? It was much more formal relationship, is what was much more about tough love. It created almost a little bit of that reverential fear, and employees actually brought that to the workplace. So the way in which we looked at our manager was very different, right? And this generation instead, I mean, their parents very often are their friends, and they give them constant positive feedback. So they're expecting the same from their managers. And this is the reason why very often they don't seem to be able, or they're perceived as not being able to manage authority or respect authority, because they're not used to looking at their fathers from the bottom up, and they don't expect to actually have to look at their bosses or managers that way either. And then 75% are not completely satisfied with their jobs, but of course that's because 90% think that they deserve their dream job. And the reason why they feel that, again, is because they were raised, you know, being told that they can be anything they want to be. And so, of course, you know, they're more likely to continue to look for what it is that makes them truly happy. So, you know, this, again, very, very different compared to any generation before them. If you also look at kind of the evolution and what this means from a recruitment perspective, we see that, you know, the generations prior to the millennials were very, you know, linear in the way in which they consider their future careers. So, for example, I graduate in, you know, finance, and I'm going to join a bank. And this was pretty much the way it works. And then all of a sudden, around the 90s, with the Gen Xers, things started to change a little bit, and it became more about the brands. So, okay, let's forget the industry. What are some brands that are really, really cool to work for? And they would focus much more on those. And then the millennials, you know, the Gen Xers started to notice, actually, that, you know, it doesn't really matter if I work for a really wonderful brand if all I do every day is serve coffee or make copies or do things that are not really impacting the organization. So they started thinking about employers from the perspective of the role. What role will I have? I want to change the world. I want to be dedicated. I want to do something that matters. What is my role within the company going to be? So students started focusing a lot more on the job opportunities than the actual brand or even the industry of choice. And then the millennials came, and that changed once again. The role is important, but the most important thing for this generation is the environment. They want to feel respected, they want to be happy, they want to feel like they don't have to change or mold or sell their soul to the devil to be able to work with an organization. They want to work in an environment where they're truly happy, and that can also meet their lifestyle. Exactly this. The fact that when they look at you as an employer, yes, it's great to know that you have fantastic financials, a wonderful brand, all these things, but what they're really going to look at is what kind of environment are you, and will you help them meet their dreams, their aspirations, become who they want to become. Another thing about millennials that's very important, I think, to highlight is the fact that Gen Xers came in pretty much one shape. So if you look at the Gen Xer population in general, and I'm one of them, we were primarily careerists, right? So that means that we are pursuing a career path. We want to work for a company that's as prestigious as possible because that reflects on us, and we want to reach, you know, certain positions within the company. Or they were leaders. Some of them were leaders, so some of them really aspired to actually climb that ladder and get to that strong leadership position. Or they were hunters, right? So the mercenaries, the people attracted by sales roles, by commission, by the challenge, by the thrill. Now, and so, you know, when companies communicated with this talent, the messages were quite consistent. It was, again, about the money, about the brand, about the career opportunities. But now, millennials are actually, as I mentioned, a very, very diverse generation. So when we look at the millennials, yes, you do have careerists, which are shrinking. They're still, you know, a strong pool, but they're shrinking. The hunters have almost disappeared, and that is a big challenge for banks or insurance companies, from any organization that is looking for sales roles, because sales is no longer a positive thing. And then leaders. And leaders also, we still find them there, although, again, it's a shrinking pool. The biggest pool of millennials is entrepreneurs, students who really want to work in an evolving environment, who really want to solve problems. Harmonizers, students who prefer a stable environment, teamwork, who want a philosophy that's balanced, where they're going to feel happy. Idealists, these are the people that basically, have very strong values and want to work for companies that can help them fulfill them. And then, of course, the internationalists. These are people that love everything foreign, and they want to work for companies that are open-minded, that prefer that offer international surroundings. They like meeting new people, traveling, working abroad, working with global teams, whether virtual or not. So, it's very important for organizations to understand who are you currently attracting, because if you are one of the big investment banks, for example, more than likely you're attracting almost exclusively careerists. And that is okay, and that was okay until now, but you're going to need to start thinking about how over the next 5 years you'll be able to attract some more of these. Because the pipelines of careerists is shrinking, and you're going to need to have, more of these other career types or archetypes into your organization. So how can you make sure to actually attract all of these different profiles? Because all of them can contribute, and you will not be able to survive on careerists alone, for example. So this is something that millennials, say, and this is a quote from a recent project, but they're not a consumer, they're not a citizen, they're not an employee, they're all those things at once, all the time. So they expect employers to embrace the complexity of their life. And if we go back to actually the slide on the different career profiles, you will see that these are pretty much career profiles that are based on the passions that these students or this generation has, no matter what. So I'm an idealist because I value things. I have very strong values and ideas and ideals, and I want to work for a company that can help me fulfill them. I'm a harmonizer. I really value a balance, and I want to work for a company. So again, they're expecting and they're looking for companies and employers where they don't have to change their lifestyle, but where they can actually complement it. Now, if we look at the millennials in the Asian talent market specifically, how are these millennials different? So what we're going to look at here, the data that I'll be presenting is based on 148,000 millennials that we surveyed across the different markets mentioned here. And of course, there's a lot of differences. I hate generalizations, and Asia, more than any other region in the world, needs to be looked at market by market. So I will also give you some individual and local flavor as well. So a couple of things. SCA, we know, is the latest battleground for talent. So this year we actually started focusing much more on these 4 markets. We have for many years, but this is really where a lot of companies are facing challenges. So you can see here we surveyed over 11,000 students in Vietnam, 7,000 students in Thailand, 10,000 students in Malaysia, 12,000 students in Indonesia, and you can see that there's a lot of different challenges that companies are facing in this part of the world. So, this is another, if you're looking at these markets, even if you're not active there yet, but are, they will be recruitment market for you over the next few years, it's really worth taking a look, because now you have the opportunity to plant your flag and gain that competitive advantage. Because they're not very spoiled in terms of opportunities, not yet, but that's going to change very, very rapidly. So when we ask Asian talent what their most important career goals are, one thing here that you can see overwhelmingly, if we look at all of APAC combined, and then if we look at China, at India, at Indonesia, at Malaysia, in Vietnam, in Singapore, is work-life balance is the #1 most attractive career goal. It's not building a sound financial base. It's not pursue certification like it was for the Gen Xers. It's having work-life balance. And you can see that's consistent everywhere with the exception of Thailand, where, of course, we see that the security and stability is important, but we also know that there's some, significant political issues that are going on currently that cause that. But we're expecting that also to change, because this is a very strong millennial trend. And then, of course, you can see also that being dedicated to a cause or serve the greater good is extremely important. It's #2 overall in Asia. And in some markets, it's very strong. In Malaysia is #3. In Singapore is #3. Security and stability, of course, is important. The international career aspect is important. And then, of course, becoming a leader or manager of people still matters. Because, again, these markets are emerging, and the idea that you're going to get to that position means financial reward, means, family, making the family proud, means many things. But in general, you can see in APAC, all in all, it's not in the top 4. It's the 5th most important attribute. So what does work-life balance mean? And this is something that I've struggled, I know a lot of companies have struggled with for many years. But basically by work-life balance, what students mean is companies normally think that it's about flexible working conditions or control over a number of working hours or respect for the people or enabling me to integrate personal interests in the schedule. So what we did, because most companies feel that it's about, it's about the hours. So if we're not Google, how can we actually manage that? If we're not a company that can allow people to just work from everywhere, how can we manage that? So we actually asked students in Asia what they really mean by work-life balance. And interestingly enough, when we ask students what they associate the most with the concept of work-life balance is respect for the people. So what that means is that they want to be themselves. They want to be respected for who they are. They understand that their parents arrived exhausted at the end of their career, not because they worked many hours, but because they had to change who they were every morning. When they went to work, they had to mold into a corporate environment. They needed to hide their personality. They needed to hide their values and just spend basically 70% of their life being different than who they are. So what they feel is that if a company respects me for who I am, then it's fine. They will understand that if something happens at home, I need to take care of it. They will make me feel good. They won't make me feel always on edge. And this is extremely, extremely important to this generation. So again, this is something for you to consider, but it's not about the hours. Even being a mother is a really tough job. I'm actually expecting now, so I will find out soon what it means, but I'm sure that there's days where, people just wonder, what they were thinking for just a split second, but it's not something they would ever change because it's part of who they are and it's something they love. And equally, that's what they expect out of the job. If it's something I like, I'm going to have good days, bad days, like I have with my significant other, with my friends, with everything, but it's not something that I'm going to dread. It's just going to be one more thing that makes up who I am. Another thing that's interesting is the concept of money. As you can see here, the importance of base salary is actually decreasing. And this is an example for Singapore, Hong Kong, and India that, of course, are some of the most emerged markets from an employer brand perspective. But if you look over the past 4 years, money has become less important. Not because it's not important, but because A, it's considered a hygiene factor, and B, because they realize that a bit of extra money actually means a lot of trade-offs. So we actually asked students how much money they would be willing to trade off, for example, from their monthly paycheck in exchange for a more positive working environment, like friendly colleagues, for example. And you can see that there's, quite a percentage that would be willing to give up, up to $500 or more a month out of their paycheck for that. And these are students who are really looking forward to that financial independence. If you ask this to professionals, they would actually be willing to trade a lot more, especially after a few years in a company. More time with their family, more time with their kids, more time to travel, more, happiness and a sense of well-being within the workplace, more sense of security and things like that. So again, that's really interesting. And then what we do is we ask the Gen Y, what is it that they will never trade? It doesn't matter if the company pays them a lot of money, but they said that they would never trade time for family, challenges, inspiring management, mentoring, development, integrity, respect for employees, positive environment, dynamic environment, development, again, good and friendly environment, job satisfaction, job security, and meritocracy. So you can see again, the environment is so important to this generation. They really, really value it. They're not willing to trade these things off. So this is causing troubles to industries like banking, for example, that were very predominant in the region because they offered higher salaries and significantly higher salaries. Well, unfortunately, we see now across the entire region that multinational banks, particularly investment banks, are actually dropping in the rankings and considered less and less ideal because the environment is too cutthroat, because they don't feel secure, stable in the job, because it's too hectic, because of many things. So again, it's all about the environment for this generation. And even if you are not Google and you can't talk about all of these things, making sure that you address the fact that who you are is important. And who you are is very well defined, what that's going to help you do is attract the right people. Very much like dating, right? So if you imagine going, I don't know, on a dating site, you want to be very honest about who you are and what you can offer, because what that's going to do is going to allow you to attract people who want just that. And that's going to help with your retention. So if that means, kind of alienating some people or not attracting everyone, that's fine. but it's really all about making sure that, you know, the core of who you are as an employer, your environment comes across very strongly, because it will attract people that will be happy in that kind of environment. Now, if you look at this slide, you see the Universal Image Framework, and this is basically a framework where we ask students across the world what they think is most attractive to them, and also what they associate with their ideal employers. The one on the top left, the one in pink, this is reputation and image. The one in blue is people and culture. The one in gray is job characteristics, and the one in purple is remuneration and advancement opportunities. And you can see that what millennials can think about when they think about a job is so much more than ever in the past. Attractive, exciting products and services, for example, friendly environment, clear paths for advancement, all these different things. So what we do is we then ask students what they think is more important, but also what they associate with specific companies or with your organization. So in this case, we're going to look at what they find to be the most attractive. So if we look at business students across Asia-Pacific, the most important thing for them is professional training and development. And then good reference for future career, a friendly working environment, high future earnings, and market success. And market success is in here only because of the emerging markets, Southeast Asia, because in the other markets it's really not that important. And then the other thing that's important is to understand how is it different among different target groups. So for engineering students, for example, a creative or dynamic working environment or challenging work is much more important. But as you can see, friendly working environment, respect for the people, all these things are always in the top 5, and base salary is not in there if you look at Asia as a whole. But then, of course, it's important to look at it country by country, right? So, for example, if you look at China with a one-child policy, money is still having a very tremendous and significant impact. So you see that actually China is one of the few markets where competitive base salary still is in the top. Thailand is another one. Professional training and development, of course, is in there. If you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, a friendly working environment, out of the 40 attributes that I showed you earlier, is the #1 most important attribute of the ideal company, followed by professional training and development, following by a creative and dynamic environment. And you can see that in emerged markets like Singapore and Hong Kong, high future earnings is always in the top, but you will not see base salary, not even in the top 10. And then in India, you can see, again, different. Leadership opportunities are very important for Indian talent, but even here, professional training and development is so important. If you look at Indonesia, they really value a creative and dynamic working environment. In Thailand, even though they very much value competitive base salary, they put friendly working environment as #1. This is such a good example of a hybrid market where you do have millennials, so they do exhibit millennial trends, the friendly work environment, but since it's a market that's emerging and that hasn't been spoiled with opportunity, of course they're still very attracted to the concept of money. But that will change very soon as they realize that it's a granted that they will get paid if they work. So, you know, not to focus too much on this, but this gives you an idea of, you know, how the millennials have shaped. If you look at Malaysia, the majority of the top 5 attributes are people and culture attributes, blue ones, friendly working environment, creative and dynamic, leaders who are supportive. So it's very important to understand this generation, but also understand how this generation has kind of grown across the different markets. Millennials are like seeds coming from a tree, and as they float east, and as they touch the soil and grow up into trees, what they grow into has a lot to do with the type of soil that they were, you know, they were planted in. And of course, each of these markets has very different realities and backgrounds. So that's impacting millennials there. If we think about Google as an ideal employer, you can see here that it's ideal because of innovation, inspiring leadership, corporate social responsibility, friendly environment, team-oriented work. Nothing in here about money. This is the reason why Google is attractive. It's almost like the Beatles of this generation, right? It embodies everything that they've never had before and that they want. But you will not see anything about money in here or nothing about being a #1 search engine. It's all about the environment. And then I wanted to touch base with you a little bit about how to reach this online generation, but I'm going to skip this because my colleague Marielle Ressing, who's the head of activation and digital for Universum, will actually be running a webinar as well on September 24th, and she will be talking about how to engage this generation. But of course, it's so important because that's the other thing. You may have the best messaging, you may go out there, but if you're relying exclusively on campus and you're not actually communicating them in the way in which they want to be communicated, you're going to have a challenge. And as you can see, the majority of millennials in Asia, they use social networks and communities as the #1 way to learn about companies. So if you rely, exclusively on campus presence or career fairs, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to engage students through the channels where they really are present. But Marielle, again, will talk more about that, and we'll focus exclusively on communication on September 24th, and we'll send you some more data about that or information. The last thing I wanted to touch upon here that I think is extremely important is the generational conflicts in the workplace. This is something that very few companies talk about, very few companies address. When people leave your organization and you have exit interviews, they will typically tell you they're leaving for more money, or they will tell you that they're leaving because their wives or their families or something. But the fact of the matter is that these are the best things they can say to make sure they leave in good terms. When we talk to the same employees and we ask them why they're leaving, it's either because they don't feel sufficiently trained and developed, so they feel like they've been trained and developed in the first couple of years and now they're not learning anything new. Or number two is because they're having conflicts with management. And that is due to generational conflicts. I'm actually asked very often to present at workshops where I actually bring baby boomers and millennials in the same room and actually talk about the differences between the two generations, or simply educate C-level executives, managers, heads of business on really how to entertain and manage this generation, how to work with them. As you can see here, a lot of companies understand that there are generational differences in the workplace, but very few of them actually see them as a positive thing. The very few of them think that they make the workplace more productive. And actually, if you look at here, you can see that, Gen Y, for example, finds it very hard to work with other generations. And you can see that other generations find it quite hard to work with the Gen Y as well. So if you look at it here, you can see that Gen Ys typically have the most challenges working with late baby boomers, and late baby boomers have more challenges working with Gen Y, while Gen Xers and early boomers are the ones that have the most challenges. So what happens is that if you spend all your time recruiting these individuals and you present to them a wonderful organization, but then your manager, who's a baby boomer, doesn't really understand why Gen Xers millennials need so much attention. They don't understand why they need so much mentorship. They find them arrogant. They find them, to not respect hierarchy. They're not going to be able to give them the support that they need. And unfortunately, that's going to cause this generation to leave, and no company can afford to lose them. So when we actually ask employees of companies why they find it hard to work with Gen Y, you can see that Gen Xers say that it's lack of knowledge, it's attitude problems, they're arrogant, they're not open to feedback, they're not mature, they don't know hardship. I remember when I graduated in the States and I moved back to Italy, got my first job, I was not enjoying it, my manager was not very nice, I wasn't doing anything valuable, and when I called my grandfather to complain about it, he got mad at me. He said, I can't believe you're complaining. You should be thankful you even have a job. You should be thankful you're getting paid. You have to pay your dues. You just started. This was the perception of a work before. So when these kids arrive in the workplace and they actually do expect to do things that matter and do expect to be treated with respect and do expect to contribute, and they don't find that, it's an issue. And for the managers who find them in the workplace, they say, who are these kids? I had to go through all this hardship before I got to my position. And you can see baby boomers also have challenges with Gen Y. And Gen Y, on the other hand, they have problems with Gen Xers because they feel that Gen Xers have preformed mindsets. They think they know it all. But particularly baby boomers, they feel that baby boomers are not open to new ideas. They're not willing to learn. They think they have it all. They are unwilling to take risks. So these things are very predominant. They happen in every workplace. And when I go and do these workshops, I really feel like a couples therapist because very often there's just no understanding. So the first step to fix that is making sure that your management is actually aware and educated and understands where this generation comes from. The reality is that even the baby boomers would have loved a friendlier boss, more time with their family, a more pleasant environment. The only difference is that the millennials actually managed to obtain it. So if you think about every major cultural revolution in history, like women's voting or African American integration, for example, I mean, you have people that fought for the cause, right, but never got to reap any benefits. All the women that fought to have the ability to vote, but never, lived long enough to cast a ballot. Or African Americans who wanted so hard to be integrated never lived to see a black president. But that does not mean that there should be, conflict between these two groups. It's the same thing. The baby boomers started the revolution. They were the idealists. It's just that in those days, they had to do it through working hard. That's the way they could achieve and the changes that they wanted. Millennials, on the other hand, they now have the opportunity to implement those changes, and there's no reason why there should be conflict. So, making sure that your teams understand that is extremely, extremely important. So to wrap that up, 85% of students worldwide say that work should be part of who they are and not just the way to make a living. So companies really need to talk about why are they here, what do they believe in, how are they going to win, together with the new talent. Talk about, making sure that they build a network of loyal ambassadors as opposed to just employees. That they become, ethically driven, that they start talking about their point of view instead of their point of difference. So really, again, who are you as an organization? That's going to attract the kind of talent that you need. Some of the things you need to ask yourself, who are these millennials? Make sure that not only you, or whoever's in a recruitment function understands that, but your employees, especially your managers, they need to understand that if they don't, they will not manage them in the right way, and you will lose these students. And you will also create an unproductive workplace. How are they different? What forces have shaped them? What do they expect, and what do you expect from them? So is it really that big of a turnoff that a student comes and asks how many vacation days they're going to have when they interview for you? When I graduated, I was told, never ask that question, or they were going to think you're lazy. And many managers are still turned off, and they think that if you ask that question, then you're not a right candidate. They may be losing on a wonderful candidate. But this generation feels that it's not that wrong for them to admit that their own time and their time to do the things they love is also important. So always make sure to think that way. What will attract them is offering teamwork and fairness, proximity to families. So think about how you can make sure that their families support their decision to work for you. Protection against risk. Make them feel that they can learn through trial and error working for you, and they're not going to be cast aside or misjudged or fired just because it takes them a while to learn, because their parents taught them that you learn by falling, right? You fall and you learn to walk. That's exactly what they expect in the workplace. They expect work-life balance in whichever way you can actually offer it. So even if you're a tough industry and you don't offer a lot of flexibility, the simple fact that you address the fact that it's important for them and that you're making baby steps in that direction, that's already going to work wonders for you. And then allow them to make a difference. Always remember that they're getting much more information than any prior generation, and most of it is through peers and family. So the word of mouth is so important. They trust their friends and family way more than they trust you, even when it comes to working for you. So if you talk to them, they normally feel that you're trying to sell them on a job. So that, use your ambassadors, use your employees, tell stories, because that they will believe. While you're assessing them, they are assessing you. Things are very different nowadays. I was recently presenting at an organization, and they asked me to present in front of their assessors. And it's interesting. It's no longer what it was, a really tough interview where you need to make sure that you come across as the perfect candidate. This is really, more of a, again, kind of dating session. Let me understand if we're right for each other. They value their diversity and life experiences. They feel that their diversity and life experiences are the #1 thing they can bring to an employer. So ask more questions about them, their values, their dreams, their experiences, their travels. This is really, they are proud of who they are. They feel that their personality is really the #1 diverse attribute they can bring to you as an organization. So don't focus only on their academic achievements. And then remember, of course, that they are your future, and they just showed up at your doorstep, so you will have to find a way to integrate them into your organizations. And just to wrap it up, a couple of things. I would like to talk about this for days if I could, but I know you probably have many more things to do. But Asia is a true battleground for global talent. What that means is that companies that have understood this generation, that have been successful engaging them elsewhere, are currently in the process of building and developing very cool and innovative strategies to be able to reach out to this target audience. So any company that doesn't do that will actually have a harder and harder time being able to get the talent that they need. Millennials are traveling east, and the way in which they're actually growing across different markets has a lot to do with the background of that market. Has a lot to do, and again, remember, they're a very diverse group. They are 7 different archetypes. So it's important to understand when you recruit, what exactly does your target group want? What do they value? Because if you're associated with a lot of wonderful things, but none of the things that are in their top 5, they're still going to probably consider you, but they're not going to choose you as their ideal company. They're not going to choose you as the company to start their career with. So you need to make sure that the things you communicate are in line with the things that are most important to them. And then the other thing, and this is the most important for any company, especially companies that are looking into Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and other emerging markets across the region, you have a unique opportunity to change the talent mind frame. Before Google existed, we surveyed hundreds of thousands of students globally, and we asked, what is one thing that an employer could do to make them really attractive? Nobody, not one person globally in hundreds of thousands ever wrote, bring my pet to work. Nobody wrote that. But then Google came in 2005 and started talking about bringing your pet to work. And the next year, everybody was writing in bringing a pet to work. I never realized how attached people are to their pets. But the reality is that students in these markets, students typically don't know what to ask for until they know they can get it. This is why the misperception is that they want money. If you go to someone who's not been exposed to a lot of attractive offerings and ask them what's most important in a job, of course they will tell you money. But if they actually start being engaged with companies that teach them that, hey, job doesn't have to be an unpleasant thing. It can be something you love. It can match your goals. It can help you, have the life that you need. It can help you contribute to the greater good. Then all of a sudden they're going to start looking at these things. So in these new markets, you have the opportunity to go in with attractive messages and change their mind frames and make them realize that, wow, there's so much more to a job, and that is going to position you as a top employer, but also as the employer that helped them actually understand what it is that really matters to them, similarly to Google back in 2005. So don't miss that chance. The other thing is make sure your local teams are truly on board. I know we have a lot of people calling from the individual markets today, but that's one of the biggest, challenges I think that the region is facing is very often they feel that global, especially multinationals, is sending or expecting the local teams to implement certain things, and the local teams don't think that these really resonate with their target audience, and they're trying to make the case that their market is different. Their market is different. And of course, it's important to have a global strategy, a global value proposition. It's important to be consistent, but the way in which this message gets rolled out has to be aligned with the preferences of the target group in that particular market. And it's only by acknowledging those differences that you will be able to really make an impact. And at the end of the day, the local teams are the ones who are responsible for bringing this brand to life. So they need to feel that, there is an understanding that the region or their market is different, and it requires a slightly, localized approach. So again, success factor will be exactly that, localization. When you talk to engineering talent, talk about what engineering talent wants to hear, as long as, of course, it's true to who you are. But you can always find that internally. And then if you go to Malaysia, make sure that you address the things that are really important to Malaysian students. And you saw in the slides before that there's very strong differences between what someone in Malaysia wants and someone in Thailand. So you need to understand that if you localize your message, your stories, your experiences, feature employees who are in those roles and who are talking about what a great environment you are, in words that resonate with the local audience, you will be able to attract all the talent that you need. And finally, just to wrap it up, always remember that your employer brand isn't what you say it is, but it's what people tell you it is. So you may think that your employer brand stands for so many wonderful things, but if when we go out externally and ask students or millennials, what do you think about working for that organization? And these things don't actually come to mind, well, that's your employer brand. So that's why it's so important not only to understand your target group's mind, but also understand what is their perception of you. Because you may not be addressing something just because you take it for granted. Of course, we have the best professional training and development. No need to talk too much about it. And then you talk to students and you find out that they actually go to your competitors because they don't think you have a strong enough training and development program. So that's the perception. Perception is reality. So it's important to understand what are your weaknesses in their minds so that you can make sure to address those and beat the competition. So I know we're done. We're over time. I know it's a lot of information. I hope I didn't go too fast. But this is obviously a topic I'm very passionate about, and I'm more than happy to discuss it with you further or talk more about how you can make sure that everyone in your organization understands this generation as well. And if any of you have any questions, please let us know. And Shu is there on hold to take any of your questions, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you. And yes, we have Joachim Ström joining in from Universum APAC, where he's the manager for the whole region. Joachim, you got a few questions. Do you think you will be able to answer them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carl. So yeah, I could see that we received 2 questions during the webinar. I think that Raquel covered most of it after we received the questions, but just to emphasize, the first question was, do you recommend that companies differentiate within Asia or take a one Asia approach with their brands? And the second question was sort of similar. How different are Asian preferences from student preferences in the West? So two good questions. But I think first of all it's important that everyone understands that there is no such thing as one Asia, and you cannot really compare Asia to the West. You really have to break out the different countries. You know, talking about one Asia is like talking about Europe as one market. So absolutely, you have to localize your approach in the different markets. As you could hear Raquel talking about how talent values different attributes in different markets. And that is because, I mean, all the markets in Asia are built up on different cultures, values, different languages, different educational systems, and so on. So it's super important to understand your target group in each market before you develop any content or any messages. So yeah, definitely it's important to localize your EVP and then come up with sort of themes, stories, and the tonality for each individual market.
Great, thank you, Joachim. We got one final question. I think it can you see any changes in the students wanting to work for more, you know, Asian-founded companies, or do they still want to work for the, you know, more European, American, international companies? Have you seen any difference in those?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. Yeah, we have seen a trend. Just a couple of years ago, we could see that most of the top or the preferred companies were MNCs coming from Europe and US. But we are really seeing now that the local companies are gaining attraction. So and then also, as you know, just a company like Alibaba, all of a sudden they have 25 billion to spend. And of course, that's really attractive for many of the Asian students to work for a company like that. They also feel a certain national pride to work for a company from their own country, especially if that company is successful outside their own country as well. And I think also in general, many students feel that the local companies are a little bit more stable, and as we know, since we are going through sort of rough times financially, we know that job security and stable employment and so on is gaining importance, and then usually the national champions are gaining a little more attention. But yeah, so in general, we also see that all the local companies in most of the markets are also starting to think strategically about their employer brand, which also makes them work harder to be more attractive. And of course, they are looking a lot at their counterparts in the West to understand what they are doing and how they are building up their organization and their culture and so on. So they're copying a lot, but they're also coming up with a lot of good things. And of course, they have a slight advantage since they understand their talent a little bit better. So yeah, definitely, we are seeing that they are improving, and we'll probably see more competition coming from local companies going forward as well.
Thank you, Joachim. Thank you everyone for joining in today. We're going to end the session now. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any more questions or if you want to discuss any of the slides. We will share most of this after the presentation, but please let us know if there's something extra interesting that you would like to hear more about. Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.